Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, today there is a big Times newspaper-sponsored conference on Africa happening with Tony Blair, remember him, proclaiming a new Africa where democracy and prosperity are spreading. Is that too chirpy? Or is he right? Should we be jettisoning old prejudices? Well, I'm joined by the Nobel Prize-winning author Nadine Gordimer, whose new novel follows the life of a couple, one black, one white, in today's South Africa. By the poet Jack Mapanje, whose new memoir chronicles his prison years under the Hastings Banda dictatorship in Malawi. And by Richard Dowden, director of the Royal African Society and author of a widely praised survey of the continent. Nadine, if we could start with you. Your novel, No Time Like the Present, follows a couple through the changing politics of the new South Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening now? What is the condition, do you think, of the ANC under Jacob Zuma, with, I think, about a couple of years to go before the next election?
Well, it's a very troubled scene at present. But one has to remind oneself, we have been free for 18 years this year. That's not even a generation. Mm. And all the rest of you, in many parts of the world, including this one, you have been generations and hundreds of years building a democracy. You still don't have a perfect democracy. You still have a great gulf between rich and poor, and even between poor and middle class. And you have unemployment problems, etc. So I would like to say always to people abroad, keep this in mind. Give us a chance. We didn't start, indeed, working against oppression only when the apartheid government became that under the name. Racism, under many different names, started in the 17th century, in 1652, when the first person from the Dutch East India Company looking for a way to India stopped off at the Cape. That was the beginning of the colonial era. And it's a long time.
So this is a long story.
It is. So you cannot expect us in 18 years, less than a generation, to have done this. I don't say this as any kind of excuse for the things that we are failing to do now.
So it seems to me that South Africa is still the moral authority, and indeed the political authority of the African National Congress, the ANC, is still, if not absolute, very, very large in the country. Nelson Mandela is still alive. The aura remains. And yet in Zuma, you've got a leader who worried a lot of people when he came to power, but whose government has not been quite as frightening as people thought when he arrived.
No, except that it contains so much corruption. Corruption seems to be the new culture, I presume, alas, not only in my own country, but in other countries as well. So far as the ANC is concerned, I have been a strong supporter of the ANC, and when it became possible to be a member, indeed then a member, and also, of course, there was the time when it had to be decided whether whites could be members or not. But that depended pretty much on your record from the way you behaved during apartheid. Now, the ANC, I am still very much a supporter of the ANC, but I think that if you are a truthful member of any party, this doesn't only give you the right, it imposes the right to criticise when it goes wrong from within. That's the only healthy way that you can have a political party. And so I am indeed troubled and critical about the way our former heroes, who remain our heroes forever because of their suffering and what they endured, during the fight against apartheid, whether it was in our army in Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, or whether it was sitting on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela.
And you now have a generation. Turning to your novel, you portray two members of the generation who were involved in the struggle originally and are now trying to find the right way to live in the new South Africa and facing all sorts of relatively familiar sort of moral dilemmas about should they send their children to private school, how do they feel about the more affluent lifestyle, should they live in the suburbs, how should they deal with former comrades who are much poorer than they are.
Yes, and of course this is exacerbated by the fact that the woman, Jabu, she's a black woman from a traditional background from KwaZulu, yeah. Fellow Zulu with Mr. our President himself, Mr. Zuma, and the husband, Steve, comes, of course, is a descendant of a colonial
a mixed Jewish, non-Jewish
and on
background.
top of it, he's mixed Jewish, non.
As you yourself are.
So there we have all the. No, I'm not mixed. I am of completely Jewish
You're completely
origin.
Right, yeah.
But I have no religious faith whatever. I just quote Yeats. What do we know but that we face one another in this place?
Very good. Yes. Yes. Facing one another in this place. There is a particular problem at the moment that you've talked about, which is the possible return of serious censorship in South Africa. You yourself were banned, your books were banned, you fought censorship during the apartheid years, and there are signs that it's coming back. More
than signs. In 2010, there was first mooted the idea of the State Protection of State Information Bill. And in November last year, 11, it was passed in the House of Assembly. Well, there is tremendous and growing opposition to it, as there should be, because in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, we have guaranteed freedom of expression, as with freedom of movement. And this bill is virtually going back to what was then called, more honestly, censorship.
And particularly censoring the right of journalists and others to question and challenge the business dealings and others of politicians, which takes us back to the corruption problem that you started off by describing.
Not only particularly, it's based on this. And indeed, we call it, tongue-in-cheek, the Protection of State Corruption Bill. Because it seems quite obvious that what is really behind it is the idea that people in government and people in finance, very often allied with the government, because we have much of the corruption comes about through tenders. You tender for some big project to the government, and the way to get your tender accepted against the next person's is to give a bribe in the right place. And of course there is evidence against, indeed, our presidents vis-à-vis the arms deal. So there is a great deal to hide. Now, the terms of this bill are very frightening indeed. If I happen to work, even in some humble position in a government department, and you are a journalist, and I tell you of something that happened there.
You're a whistleblower, as we would say.
I'm a whistleblower, yes. It's the whistleblower as well as the person who publishes or speaks out on the information who indeed is liable to a sentence of from 5 to something like 25 years.
Now that is extraordinarily and draconian. Before we open the conversation out, can I also ask you about Malema and the sort of fear that there is a more radical, angrier youth movement coming through the
Well,
the
there was this fear, but Malema has behaved in such a wild and irrational manner. He has insulted everybody, calling a leader of the Democratic Party a white bitch who sleeps with the people that she works with, and calling members of the government, the cabinet, baboons. He has really
alienated enough people.
Yeah, but he showed him to have really completely irrational and crazy ideas. This is a great pity in a way, because some of the changes that he wants to see made are indeed needed and reasonable, but they are blurred and trashed by the way he presents them.
Richard Dowden, to what extent is what happens in South Africa that we've been hearing about now absolutely critical to the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, or at least the southern half of sub-Saharan Africa?
For southern Africa, it's vital, and it is the only large manufacturing state in Africa. So it's the powerhouse, but it won't be indefinitely, and maybe not for much longer. Countries like Nigeria, Angola are now moving up very, very rapidly, and unless South Africa takes another leap forward, it will be overtaken as the economic powerhouse of the continent.
And Nadine, when it comes to the sort of political future for South Africa, how long do you think, I mean, you're a supporter of the ANC, but how long do you think before we see another party taking power in South Africa, or a coalition of parties taking power in South Africa?
Well, we've had a sort of coalition, haven't we? We've had a government of national unity.
Yes.
Yes. But with an ANC majority.
Yes.
Yes. It's very difficult to say what will happen. It's very likely, I think, and this is an only partly informed opinion, as it can only be for an individual, it looks as if the ANC might divide, and it might be an ANC, but not the same one that there is now.
Yes.
I mean, I travelled to South Africa fairly regularly over the years. I first came in 1979, and I try and think whether the attitudes of the whites I'm with has changed very much. And I have to say, I don't feel that it has. I mean, they're much more cautious, but they still live in their little castles. And outside that, you have this anger, which I think Malema, as you say, expresses. Mm-hmm. Now, one or two people have said to me that they're waiting for the old man to die, for Mandela to die. While he's there, out of respect, they won't do anything. But when he dies, there will be an explosion. And so when the rest of the world is in mourning, we might see a lot of bad stuff going down in South Africa. Is that possible? It's
like saying that God in heaven sees that we live a just and honest life. Mandela, who is someone beyond any concept of what you can be in your life, he is not at all involved now. He's an idea, as I say, like some deity somewhere. And his death will be tremendously mourned. It'll be a shock not only to us, but he was such a figure for the rest of the world as well. But it will not affect, in my opinion, and that of many others, it will not affect what happens subsequently. The power struggles are there, and the fact that Mandela is still present, though taking no part at all, it doesn't influence. He has no longer any influence on policies. He doesn't indeed speak out anymore. That role has gone over to Desmond Tutu.
Yes. Jack Mapanje, I suppose that is one of the great differences between South Africa and anywhere else in Africa, that your country, Malawi, unfortunately had Hastings Banda for so long. We'll come on to talk about him. But nobody else has had somebody, as Nadine Gordimer has just said, who has become an idea, whose moral authority is so great that they have sort of radiated out there for enough time for the society to begin to heal and to change.
No, not my part of the world and the experience that I have had. But coming back to Nadine's novel, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Because I was really fascinated by it. And what I like about it is how brave it is, and how the writer is able to include in the background, perhaps, story of Steve and Jabu, Mandela, Mbeki, and the latest one, Zuma, and so on.
It's a great education in South African politics.
It is. And what is fascinating to me is Nadine has now joined the rest of, if you like, the rest of the African world, who have written about novels of disillusionment and frustration. We start on the African continent with Chinua Achebe's A Man of the People, And we go on to Kenya with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Petals of Blood. And in Ghana, there was the first reaction to the freedom there was The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And now Nadine is so brave, and I love the context in which this general theme is being treated. And the revelation of what goes on in South Africa through the novel is fascinating.
It's interesting. I was thinking, if we were sitting here in the 1970s talking about the USSR and trying to take its moral temperature, we would go to poets and novelists. And Africa is probably the only place in the world where it feels completely natural to do the same today, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. I think I think with the writers, people like Chimamanda and Adichie and others. I mean, that's where the cutting edge is, I think, in Africa in terms of thought and feeling about being African. I mean, the biggest change I've noticed since I first went to Africa, and this is a long time ago in the early 70s, is a growth in African self-confidence. And that's the biggest breakthrough of all. Suddenly we don't have to do everything like the rest of the world. Please tell us how to do this and that. No, we know what we're doing now, and we know where we're going.
Yes.
But that frustration is not new, because we've seen it in the Republic of Ireland. I remember you mentioned W.B. Yeats.
Yes.
I've got 3 lines here which I thought I should just mention. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? For this that all the blood was shed, all that delirium of the brave? And that is absolutely what you have managed to do.
In your novel, Nadine, these are people who have gone through a period that was heroic, which lit up their lives in very stark tonal contrasts, and they now find themselves, in many ways, in the world of the rest of us, worrying about education and power cuts and money and income and so on.
But with a big difference, because there's something else in that book, and that is... Right, now black and white can live together. They can be lovers, they can marry. You don't go to jail for this, as they did during the apartheid time. But the cultural differences, the background, means that their coming together has different aspects. And I think that, I hope that's in the book, that certain things that happen Jabu reacts to rather differently from Steve. They understand each other perfectly. You have to learn to accept that he has to accept that he can never really be exactly African the way she is.
He can't penetrate
He's earned his right to be an African by being in the struggle. And she has to accept that she has moved away from her father and family and their attitudes in KwaZulu. For instance, the idea that her father still has, that no matter whether he approves or disapproves of the marriage, a woman must listen to her husband and be guided by her husband. So here you get the difference between traditionalism and change. Whereas everybody who is in the traditional world now is indeed using their cell phone and their computer and tweeting or whatever you call it. So these are other changes that come about when people who have been apart come together. And it's part, indeed, it's an undertone to the political changes that they have to deal with openly.
Well, I'd like to hear now from Jack Mapanje, who went to prison not for loving the wrong person, but for writing the wrong poem. This goes back to the rule of Hastings Banda, who was for a long time seen in this country as a rather saintly figure. He was a sort of Church of Scotland member, and he was meant to be the good dictator, as it were, or the good new leader, heroic leader of the struggle. But your story really starts at university. You're in your university department, and pretty much there's a knock on the door.
Yeah. And to go slightly back a little, with your earlier point, Banda started very well. We all loved him at the beginning, and this is the problem about these leaders. We love them when they come in, but afterwards something goes wrong.
Yes.
Banda started very well, but after 5, 6, 10 years, he made himself president for life. And that made it even more difficult for everybody. So the central problem for us in the university was academic freedom. There wasn't any of it. And anybody who protested about anything, first of all, it was not possible to protest. But even if you protested surreptitiously, that would be taken up by the young pioneers or by the security, and then you were in trouble. I was arrested at a Gincana club in the afternoon, and nobody told me why I was arrested.
And you were genuinely confused at the time?
I was extremely confused. The one thing that I can say is that everybody suspected that they could be arrested any time. That's the only thing I could think of. But when they came to me and said, His Excellency, the life president has directed us to arrest you and detain you, I was totally shattered. I was a respectable member of the university, head of department, and the rest of it. But for some strange reason, they just simply came.
And you left your respectable, relatively sort of posh academic life. You've been travelling abroad to conferences. Your poems had been published abroad, and so on. And you found yourself shackled and in filthy clothes in the most abominable conditions for years in this prison.
And I would have expected, therefore, if it had been another country, another African country, that people would be delighted that I was putting the country on the map, on the literary map of Malawi and the rest of it. But no, suddenly I'm stripped naked, and I don't know what to think.
And don't they ask you why? For you to write the accusations. Why have you been arrested? Tell us why we've had to arrest you.
Well, that's exactly the point. The point is I'm brought before these commissioners, and they're saying we do not understand because you are not in our books. So can you tell us?
Please explain why we've arrested you.
Please explain why we should arrest you and put you in prison. And I'm shattered, totally shattered. I didn't know what to say.
It's a terrible story. You've called your memoir "And Crocodiles Are Hungry at Night." Just remind us why.
Well, effectively, because if you protested against Dr. Banda, they came to you, the Malawi young pioneers came to you in the middle of the night, and they abducted you and they threw you away to crocodiles down in the lower Shire.
Yeah.
And that was the end of you.
And that's what you thought was going to happen to you for quite a long time.
I was going to, that's the direction I was going to go. But I was very lucky in a way. That's an aspect of my luck.
And another aspect of your luck is that when you were in this terrible prison, you were surrounded by some other very strong characters, and you supported each other, writing tiny little notes. It's very Solzhenitsyn-like, I have to say. It's a hot version of the Gulag Archipelago. Does this book feel like? But there were finally ways of communicating outside.
Final ways. Human beings have certain sort of resilience about them, and we were able to communicate surreptitiously. We found these colleagues in the university, two of them initially, David Kerr, who was in fine and performing arts, and in the English department was Father Pat O'Malley. And then we had a very, very special friend amongst the warders, who we named Noriega, just for, he was such a brave man. And so we would send our notes through him, and then he would take them to the university, and the university would pass them on all the way to York, to another friend of ours, Landeg White, and so on. And then the rest of the world, BBC and Deutsche Welle and Voice of America, knew all about it. I was arrested on a Friday. The Saturday, they knew that.
And you didn't know that they knew, but that for a long time the likes of Harold Pinter and all sorts of people were standing outside Broadcasting House here and all through London, keeping your name up there. And without that, perhaps you would not have made it.
I don't think I would have made it without that. And my story, to be absolutely honest, it's a very unique story, and I do not know who to thank, not only God but everybody else, because the Linguistics Association of Great Britain and Language Society of America, the literature associations in the Commonwealth, as well as writers like, as you suggested, Harold Pinter, Tom Stoppard,
yes,
and various other writers got together and to take the placards and to go to the Malay High Commission in London and stood there. And these papers, this went on in the papers. The Guardian was carrying this, when one of these was smuggled into prison, we had a good laugh, because suddenly we realized there's a whole world out there fighting for us. Let's hang on.
Yes.
Let's hang on, we said.
And you hung on for 3 years, 7 months, 16 days, and 12 hours.
Yes.
And you're now. But I mean, this starts with poetry. I think we should hear some of your poetry, actually. So before we open this out, can you read us something, please?
Yes, I'm going to read you something which I have recently published. It's I'm trying to go back to Africa as part of the story, which anybody who's going to read Nadine's book will understand this. One aspect, I've lived in England now for 21 years, and my grandchildren were saying, is grandpapa going to Africa then? And then I took that on as a possible poem. Grandpapa travelling on the road again, this time bound for sands of the Sahara, to hunt wild kudu where lions roam among the gazelle. Indeed, 20 great years in one morass was a miracle. And to become a tenant on this global farm, this time round, son, don't botch it. Don't fear, fight or mock the vulture-beaked mane, or the freckled hunchback women who block your way draped in vipers. Milk every drop of their wisdom for you to leave your footprints, not your lips there, as the ancients said once upon a time.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I wonder if I could just,
Nadine,
in the context that you brought forward, that indeed the writers have a different kind of history of struggle beyond the facts, the mere facts. Of course, Jack's book is a classic. It's a wonderful book, and a classic one goes back to again and again for its insights. I would like to bring to the attention of readers a book by a man called Mongani Wally Soroti. I'm sure Jack knows who that is.
Him, yes.
Now, Soroti has written a novel. Instead of the customary memoir, he has written a novel called Scatter the Ashes and Go. And it comes out of his experience in Spear of the Nation, Mkhonto Wisizwe, in the bush and in the desert. We all have read the heroic stories, and they are heroic. But he goes to the other side of it. Even if you are shut away in this situation, and you may be killed any day, and of course this is common, I suppose, in all wars, whether they're guerrilla wars or the regular kind, there are tensions between the people who are shut up together under the threat that they may indeed need not see the next day. And this novel deals with the jealousies, the irritation of somebody's habits who lives beside you, the boredom of their views and the enlightenment of their views. In other words, the special character of the intimate relations when you are in this situation. So I would like to know that it would be, I hope, published here, Scatter the Ashes and Go by Mongani Wally Soroti, and I highly recommend anybody who has drawn a great deal from Jack Mapanje's writing to turn now to Soroti.
To that too. That's a piece of good advice as a publisher right there listening, I'm sure. Jack Mapanje, you clearly would love to go back to Malawi, but the situation is not perfect there, even after the fall of Banda.
I'm afraid it is not, and And that's really the big problem that we have right now. And the reason why I wrote this at this time, got it published by Ayabia Clark Publishing, a small publishing company in Oxford. The reason why I had this published now is because the situation is coming back to the old again. Academics and students were fighting the government again over academic freedom. It's just been resolved, but not totally gone. And the new man who is an economist. The first was a medical doctor who built more prisons than clinics. The second was a businessman who gave everybody the freedom, except the freedom from corruption. And the third one is supposed to be an economist, but he has messed up the economy of the country completely, and people can't travel anymore. There's no petrol there, and so on and so forth. It's really horrific, and I do not know where to go. I would like to go back home, but where will I go? What can I do?
Right at the beginning, I said that Tony Blair was addressing this conference, and he said that Africa was moving ahead. And I was asking whether he was being too chirpy. And it sounds from what we've been saying that he was being too chirpy. I just wanted to read something out and then ask Richard Dowden about it from the Royal African Society. He says that, Blair says in his article in the Times, the number of democracies in sub-Saharan Africa has skyrocketed from 3 in 1989 to 23 in 2008. Since 1991, African governments have been defeated at the ballot box 30 times. Between the 1960s and 1991, that happened only once. So he's presenting a picture of, there are movements in both directions, but a picture of pretty fast advance politically, Richard.
I think it is, but it's a recovery rather than a something absolutely new. We have to go back to, I would go back to around the end of the Cold War. The West moves into Eastern Europe. That's the future. Aid to Africa is cut to shreds. Africa is ignored, handed over to the World Bank, which imposes structural adjustment. The states of Africa and the whole project in the first 20 years of African independence was state building. These states are literally torn to pieces. And the answer, the prescription was democracy. From the West was you've got to be democratic, you've got to have human rights, and you've got to have the free market. But as the American Assistant Secretary of State, Hank Cohen, rather glibly said at the time, if you get the third one right, the free market, you get a discount on the other two. Wonderful American cynicism. But it was abandoned for 10 years, and you have 24 wars in the 90s in Africa, at least 24 wars, as these states just fall apart. Rebels that have been suppressed by dictators explode. And then Africa does begin to turn round, but not because of that Western prescription. It turns around because, one, China moves in and pushes the price of raw materials. 2, mobile phones come, and there are now something like 500 million mobile phones. And thirdly, there's the new middle class in Africa, and those are the factors that turned Africa around. The elections now, yes, but most presidents know how to manage an election if they're good, and they somehow get themselves re-elected.
And Nadine Gordimer mentioned mobile phones earlier on. Mobile phones, you argue, have changed Africa more than anywhere else in the world. Absolutely,
yeah. Not just because people are texting. Jack's his arrest would have been known immediately. Yes. And all this is done, and they're watching the Arab Spring. They're listening in, they're texting, tweeting, talking about this. But at an economic level, in the markets now, you see market women. This was the surprise. Mo Ibrahim, the great, who founded Celtel, the biggest, which was once the biggest mobile phone company in Africa, said he got it completely wrong. He thought the top 3% might want a mobile phone, but it was the bottom of the pyramid that wanted a mobile phone, and it showed Africa was
price of produce
exactly.
Or goods.
You see the market women, and they always have they use their bra as their wallet. They have the money down one side, and now they've got the mobile phone down the other, checking the price in other markets. Yeah. And it's just, it's transformed trade in Africa. So it has a huge economic effect as well.
What about the contrast between sort of Western imposed nationhood and tribal divisions in Africa? Certainly in Jack Napanji's book, I mean, one of the issues is the divisions between the North and the South in Malawi, and huge sort of suspicions between the two groups.
Yeah, they're huge. I mean, just it was the lines drawn on the map of Africa were so arbitrary. I mean, it was literally a carve-up by the Europeans. Before that, there were between 6,000 and 10,000 political unions, so little mini-states, if you like, and they then became what are now 54 countries. And the people there had no say whatever in the drawing of those lines. And then the creation of those, so the creation of those states was just completely artificial, and they've had to, and there was something like 2,000 languages in Africa. 2,000. I mean, you think how much problem we have in Europe with, what have we got, 23?
Yes.
These are societies that exist, and now they're all forced to live together as Ugandans or Zimbabweans. Yeah, you've got 11.
11 in South Africa.
Nigeria's got 400 and counting.
Yeah,
how do you create a state out of... And neighbours always were tend to not to get on with each other.
How do you create an educational system that deals with this?
Yes, yeah. So Africa has... When we say, the special problems of Africa, a lot of them go back to what happened in the 20th century. I'd also like, before we finish, to talk a little bit about China. Because another thing that you hear in this country and in Europe is, we may have had problems as colonisers, but now they've got the Chinese. They're not going to like the Chinese anymore. They're raping Africa. They're ripping out the natural resources. They're giving nothing back. You think it's a rather more complicated picture than that, Richard?
I would, yes. All the ecological stuff, I absolutely concede. But I think the big advantage that the Chinese have in Africa, why they're liked there, particularly by governments, they have no mission to change Africa. They have no mission to civilise or to Christianise. They deal with Africa exactly as it is. And that, I think, is a big plus for African governments. They'll deal across the table like that. And... so they don't, and I think also they, the Chinese, they brought a huge amount of resources. They started this big, the big revival in that way. And they're not imperialist. They may be colonizers, but they're certainly not imperialist. And I think in that way they've given African governments a chance to push back against the dictates of the West.
Interesting. Nadine, clearly China is hugely influential in Zimbabwe now. Do you notice
but
Chinese...
I'm thinking about my own country.
Yes, I was going to say.
Yes, and there it's very different from the perception of Richard, which goes back perhaps a couple of years, because the ordinary people, the workers, are very much disturbed about the fact that the Chinese come in, wonderful, they start up new enterprises, but they want to bring their own workers. They say, you don't understand how to use it. And
because South Africa's got good strong trade union rights and
precisely,
limited working days.
The Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, and others are very troubled, and the average person is very troubled about this.
But I totally agree with you. I think that's their one great weakness, is... that China, there is not. I think there should be a Royal African Society prize for the first person to find an African boss of Chinese workers, and I think that's their biggest weakness.
Yes, you're right. They're also taking over some strange things. The Standard Bank, I think you all know that Standard Bank is known all over the world, and of course it is the biggest bank in the African continent, the most powerful. In South Africa, already over a year ago, the Chinese bought 20% of this bank, of the Standard Bank. That's not pence, Yeah. 20% of the African bank. This is rather troubling.
Yeah. So they are moving in a big way. And the final thing, Richard, that you mentioned was the rise of the black African middle class. Now, it's happening, as Nadine's novel shows us, to a certain extent in South Africa, but you point particularly to a country we haven't talked about, Nigeria, as being perhaps the most exciting example of this.
Nigeria is, well, southern Nigeria, particularly the state of Lagos, which if it was an independent country would be the fourth largest economy in Africa. You just feel the dynamism of this place. It is chaotic, there is a lot of violence, but there is a huge amount of creativity. And local Nigerian middle class growing up, but also returnees and people coming backwards and forwards. And it's not dependent on the oil. That's the big thing. This is all manufacturing and trade. And it is just exploding. And then you see this, in other West African countries, Ghana as well, a new dynamism which is driven by pretty well-educated people who want to start trading and making money. And that, I think, is really transforming Africa. You feel it very strongly in Kenya as well.
Jack Mapanje, are you going to end your days, do you think, as a patriarchal figure, overseeing a usually self-confident middle class in your part of Africa, in Malawi?
There is a small group of young fellows, especially those who have had exposure from outside, who are coming back in. And they don't care about the corruption of the government. They're doing their thing. They're simply saying, "Oh well, we'll do what we have to do." And the rural areas are absolutely amazing. You have not only mobile phones, but the mobile phones are being charged by batteries of rotten cars. So you are able to communicate directly and so on.
Nadine, your novel is a very questing look at what's going on in South Africa just now, and you raise lots and lots of problems. But do you remain basically an optimist for your country, about your country?
A realistic optimist, if there is such a thing. My belief is if we could have defeated apartheid with all the propping up that it had from the West, including this country, surely we can bring about that better life that was promised so grandly when we got our freedom. I would like to ask a specific question, mainly of Richard. Of course, this comes after your book ends. I wish that you would come back and write an appendage to it, particularly since there's a move toward nationalisation. There's a cry for nationalisation of mineral wealth.
Yeah, I'm working on the second edition right now, Nadine.
Well, that's good to hear. On that note of realistic optimism, thank you all very much indeed. Richard Dowden, Director of the Royal African Society and author of Africa, Altered States, Ordinary Miracles, second edition coming. Nadine Gordimer's No Time Like the Present and Jack Mapanje's And Crocodiles Are Hungry at Night are both out now. Next week, Anne McElvoy is going to be here, talking to Werner Herzog, Jeff Dyer, Liz Mermin and Paul Farley. But for now, goodbye and thank you. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum.
Be members or not, but that depended pretty much on your record from the way you behaved during apartheid. Now, the ANC, I am still very much a supporter of the ANC, but I think that if you are a truthful member of any party, this doesn't only give you the right, it imposes the right to criticise when it goes wrong from within. That's the only healthy way that you can have a political party. And so I am indeed troubled and critical about the way our former heroes, who remain our heroes forever because of their suffering and what they endured during the fight against apartheid, whether it was in our army in Umkhonto we says we're the spear of the nation, or whether it was sitting on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela.
And you now have a generation turning. So it seems to be that South Africa is still the moral authority and indeed the political authority of the African National Congress, the ANC, is still, if not absolute, very, very large in the country. Nelson Mandela is still alive. The aura remains. And yet in Zuma, you've got a leader who worried a lot of people when he came to power, but whose government has not been quite as frightening as people thought when he arrived.
No, except that it contains so much corruption Corruption seems to be the new culture, I presume, alas, not only in my own country, but in other countries as well. So far as the ANC is concerned, I have been a strong supporter of the ANC, and when it became possible to be a member, indeed in a member, and also, of course, there was the time when it had to be decided where the whites could go. So I would like to say always to people abroad, keep this in mind. Give us a chance. We didn't start, indeed, working against oppression only when the apartheid government became that under the name. Racism, under many different names, started in the 17th century, in 1652, when the first person from the Dutch East India Company looking for a way to India stopped off at the Cape. That was the beginning of the colonial era. And it's a long time.
So this is a long story.
It is. So you cannot expect us in 18 years, less than a generation, to have done this. I don't say this as any kind of excuse for the things that we are failing to do.
It's a little bit about what's happening now. What is the condition, do you think, of the ANC under Jacob Zuma, with, I think, about a couple of years to go before the next election?
Well, it's a very troubled scene at present. But one has to remind oneself, we have been free for 18 years this year. That's not even a generation. And all the rest of you, in many parts of the world, including this one, you have been generations and hundreds of years building a democracy. You still don't have a perfect democracy. You still have a great gulf between rich and poor, and even between poor and middle class. And you have unemployment problems, etc.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, today there is a big Times newspaper-sponsored conference on Africa happening with Tony Blair, remember him, proclaiming a new Africa where democracy and prosperity are spreading. Is that too chirpy? Or is he right? Should we be jettisoning old prejudices? Well, I'm joined by the Nobel Prize-winning author Nadine Gordimer, whose new novel follows the life of a couple, one black, one white, in today's South Africa. By the poet Jack Mapanje, whose new memoir chronicles his prison years under the Hastings Banda dictatorship in Malawi. And by Richard Dowden, director of the Royal African Society and author of a widely praised survey of the continent. Nadine, if we could start with you. Your novel, No Time Like the Present, follows a couple through the changing politics of the new South Africa. Could you tell us